All right, I'm here with Sebastian Michaels, who's going to chat with us about his upcoming classes at the Photoshop Virtual Summit 4. Thanks for joining me on this, Sebastian. Appreciate it.
Hey, excited to be part of it. I put together two courses for this one that I feel bookend, in a sense, where photo artistry really comes to play, because we have a lot of people, I think, who are photographers and they even understand a lot of stuff in Photoshop, but how do you make that step, that leap into being an artist? And so when I sat down and asked myself that, I went back to my own roots. And in my actual presentation, I'm actually going to show my very first piece of photo artistry I ever created, where I felt like
Nice.
I'm an artist. I did something that's artistic.
Awesome.
And up until then, it was a lot of like illustration stuff and a lot of photography stuff. I did a lot of wedding photography things and all that. But when I actually said, okay, I want to create something artistic, how do you go about that versus trying to become this great artist out of nothing? How do you do
Right.
that? It's
Sure.
just such a big thing to try to attempt. But if you
Right.
start small and you say, okay, well, how do I ease into this art thing and feel like I'm actually doing things that are not just cool or pretty, but are artistic? That's what I tried to really tackle with my first session. And
Right.
it's called Found Object Photoshop. And it's all
Mhm.
about going out with the express intention of finding something to bring back to turn into art. And with your camera, of course, you're going out with your camera. And you can start as simple as that, where you're literally just going out and say, I'm going to take my camera, I'm going to go for a walk around the block downtown, and I'm going to try to find something that I can turn into a work of art. And just having that as your objective changes what it's like to be out with your camera, changes the kind of photos you're going to capture, changes what you're even looking for to begin with. And it gets the wheels running ahead of time of, okay, how am I going to put that on a canvas and what am I going to do with it? Once it's there, then what?
Mhm.
And so that's like the beginning. So that was part of the initial exploration. But then I said, well, what else could you do if you really wanted to turn each one of these little adventures into a true artistic adventure, where you're going to come back not just with a cool photo to work with, but the other materials that you would need to turn it into an actual work of art? What would that look like? And what would that experience look like? And how could you turn that into an ongoing challenge for yourself, especially, again, if you're beginning, if you're just getting
Mhm.
started? So the example I'm going to work on in the first session is a pretty straightforward, basic example. It's the kind of thing that I think anybody who's a photographer and has a working knowledge of even the basics of Photoshop should be able to follow along with. And it's just a starting thing. Obviously, wherever your skill level is, you can carry this as far as you want to
Sure.
go as an exercise.
Right.
And I'm even going to work in, I just thought it would be fun. I went out to replicate this and I came back with this set of photos, and I'm actually going to include those as one of the VIP things, just to see what other people can do with those same photos. Because one of the points I tried to make in the session that I'm always making is there is not one answer to any artistic challenge you give to yourself. You could take the same photo and put it in the hands of 50 different artists, and they'll give you 50 different versions or visions of what's possible with that. So that's kind of my first main session, is
Right.
diving into
I
that.
I love the idea too that it's not like here's a long list of very special, unique props you have to
No,
rent or something. It's just like things you find literally that are
literally
on the
what
side of
you
the
find.
road or wherever it might be.
Exactly. It's literally found object Photoshop. It's partly it's that intent. I think that's part of what makes it so special, because it's one thing just to go through your life with your camera, taking pictures, and then just having it, maybe I'll try to let me look through what I've got. Oh, maybe I could do something with that. That's a different experience than an artist. If you
Mhm.
picture imagine your vision of a real artist, like a real artist. They don't just wander around and maybe something happens. Every day they create art. They set about the act of making something creative and something that expresses their talent and their artistry and their taste and their whatever themes or concepts they want to bring into it. But it's a chosen act. And I think that's what's so special about this. It's a
Mhm.
very simple exercise, but when you see what all that can entail, I think it's pretty exciting. And I think it can make a difference in a lot of people's photography, because it just makes walking out the door with your camera an adventure every
Right.
time, because you have a mission. You're on a mission in that sense. So that's the first one. So I think it's going to be pretty exciting for people.
And I think part of that the process is that it doesn't even really matter if you come up with an end result that you love or not. It's
No.
just kind of going through that exercise and the thought process behind it of creating.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes, and I can't even quote myself very accurately, but basically it boils down to, in the beginning especially, but even throughout your career as an artist, it's not about any given piece. It's about who are you becoming as an artist because you're even trying to create a piece.
Hmm.
Think about how many people, I mean, the vast majority of people, but I mean, just think of the number of people you know who are actually active, engaged artists, even actively engaged photographers. That's a small subset. And then when you go to an actively engaged, like I'm trying to create art here, that's an even smaller subset of people who are saying, I'm not satisfied with just capturing what's in front of me, which is a challenge in and of itself. Capturing a great photo is already a challenge. But now, how do I push that further and turn it into something that's an actual work of art that I could be proud of as a work of art that you could hang as a fine art piece possibly, or get published in a magazine or make a book cover out of or whatever, but where it's not just a photo anymore. You've pushed it further. And not many people ever push themselves to even try that. So that's what that whole first session's about.
Right.
The second session is kind of on the other end. So the first session is more beginner, intermediate, and it's basically the execution of it is wherever you are, wherever you are in terms of your skill. But the second session is all about dramatic lighting and shading, about how do you take any given work of art or any given photo, and how do you use lighting to make it more dramatic and more exciting and more vivid, tell a better story, and how do you use shading and shadows to not only complement that story, but make sure it looks real. Because shading is it has that twin aspect. If you don't have your shadows right, then things don't look like they're throwing the shadows they're supposed to be throwing. The illusion is lost. And there are so many works of art I've seen where that's where they fail. There's something that just doesn't come through. And when you look closer, you're like, it's because the shadows aren't where they're supposed to be, or the light's coming in from this area, but this side's lit, but that side's not. So just thinking through the lighting and shading is important for realism. But then if you go to the next step and you think in terms of lighting and shading as a dramatic tool to tell a better story or just to make a cooler image, that's what this session is going to be about. And it's going to culminate with some key post-production steps that I recommend with any work of art or any fine photograph you might want to tackle at the end of the process. Like, you've gone through everything, you've assembled all your materials, you've created what you think is a cool piece of art, you've even lit and shaded it. What are those final 2, 3, 5, 10 layers that you're going to stack onto the very top of your layer stack to push this thing forward enough to where it's going to unify all the material, it's going to bring it all together and finish it off to where it really does feel like a work of art. It feels like a professional, polished work of art, not just a cool composite. Beginners tend to go just as far as the composite, and then they've worked enough and they're like, okay, it looks cool, and then they call it a day. But another 20 minutes or another 10 minutes even with just a few key layers, if you know which kinds of layers to play with, can unify the entire piece, bring all of it together, tone it in the satisfactory way, and basically bring all of your effects up another notch to where anybody looking at it is arrested by the professionalism of the piece. Not just, oh, that's cool, but wow. And that's kind of the effect we're going for. So that's what the second session is about, is all the techniques. Now, I couldn't fit everything in. I mean, you could literally spend a week just talking on that subject. But I tried to work in the techniques and approaches that I feel are the most artistic and the most connected to thinking of your photo artistry the way you would if you were a painter. So the effect at the end doesn't have to look like a painting, but if you think of the greatest, mesmerizers of using light and shadow, so many of them were, for instance, the great masters and people like Vermeer. Their use of light in their paintings, the light and shade, was so powerful, and Rembrandt's work, for instance, that if you can take that approach and bring it to your photo artistry, you can work some magic there. So I really tried to key in on the techniques that will work best with that kind of a thought process and that kind of an approach. But I ran out of space. So again, like in the VIP thing, I created a whole separate half-hour session just on additional techniques with another really amazing composition, just to bring some of that in to not only re-emphasize and underscore some of the techniques that I started with in the session, but to introduce a few techniques that I couldn't fit in, but I would feel guilty if I didn't give, because if you don't have them, you might spend a half hour or 45 minutes just monkeying with the thing, trying to get it to work. killing yourself, where if you knew one or two clever techniques, well, you just did it in 5 minutes and it looks
Sure.
great. So so much of it comes down to that. There are a million ways to do things in Photoshop, but if you know a handful of ways that are artistic and effective, that's really all you need. And so,
Right.
but I needed to make sure I covered those. So
That
that's all.
sounds fantastic. That sounds great, Sebastian, and I really appreciate the fact that we have such an interesting range of classes in a summit like this, where
Yeah.
some are very photographic centric, like color correction, things like that. But I would imagine that even a photographer who may or may not have that much desire to be quote unquote artistic would still gain something just from the theory of what the kind of things you're talking about could even improve their photography.
Absolutely. And while in that session, I do talk about compositing some compositions, the final post-production stages, and even in general, the main techniques for lighting and shading, you can apply those to any photograph. You can
Sure.
take any cool photograph and make it better if you just dive in there with a simple dodge and burn layer, just spending the time, but knowing how to think through it all and think through, okay, now that I've done that, what's the next step to make it really unify? How do I push this through Adobe Camera Raw in the right way? What kinds of things should I be paying attention to? What kind of, should I layer in a texture? If so, how do I do it? How do I mask the effect off of different things? I have to assume that people who are watching that session have some general notion of the basics of Photoshop, but I still hit on them all, because if I can touch on each of the key elements that they're going to need, in the sense of working as a painter, then all of a sudden Photoshop becomes not like this scientific tool that you use just to pull sliders around and press buttons. It becomes something that you're painting light with, you're painting shadow with, you're rendering, a cool effect in some part of the corner of like a landscape image that wasn't there in the original photo. So you're kind of stuck with the photo if you don't know how to do some of this stuff.
Sure.
So I think that's part of it. So it can also be used just to take a cool photo and make it an even better photo, without
Awesome.
a question.
Well, that sounds great. I'm sure, like anyone, I've joked about the fact that probably, well, I'm pretty sure almost every one of these chats that I'm with instructors, I've ended by saying, I can't wait to watch your classes. But it's true. I mean, that's one of the things I love the most about the summit, is just seeing so many interesting different takes on this one piece of software that we all ultimately use. So thanks so much for taking the time to share some information about your classes. I really appreciate it.
And just to reiterate what you just said, it's astonishing to me, and I've been around Photoshop for over 20 years actively, like I'm just living and breathing it, and I still learn stuff. It's crazy. And it's because different people pull from different skill sets and different backgrounds that require different skill sets. So, and I suppose that's kind of what I bring to this a little bit, is I came from this artistic background, and I went out there and tried to create art with Photoshop with nothing to work with whatsoever, except for what I could gather in a 15-minute walk. And that led to this first session 20 years later.
Nice.
So, and again, I think you'll be amused when you see my very first piece of photo art. It's not bad, but it's not great. I mean, it's my first piece. Everybody's got to start somewhere.
It was your first one, and it was quite a long time ago too.
Yeah. So I made sure to work that in at the beginning, and maybe that'll help reassure some people, like, oh, okay, that's where he started. And now look, right. And then when you look at what is possible, when you get more and more advanced, I really try to showcase a lot of my students' art in my presentation when I was putting together the presentation, because these are real artists who have gone from nothing to now they're producing work that's truly professional caliber. And when you look at it, it is just dazzling, but it's so neat in the session. It's fun because I can then show you, okay, well, here are the layers. Here's how this came about. And then it all of a sudden becomes accessible. So I think in the examples that I've chosen to work with in these sessions, in both sessions, really, the examples, it makes it accessible in a way that it takes away that intimidation. Because if you just look at a finished work of amazing photo art and you think, whoa, I could never do that because look at my photos. And they don't realize, well, they started with a photo like that too. They just then started stacking layers, and they knew what to do along the way. And they worked in the lighting and the shading and all this different stuff. And they built something that's magnificent. They didn't capture that out of the camera that way, right, obviously. So I think it'll be inspiring to people that way. But then other people, other teachers throughout the summit, I mean, they have so many other nuances that if you bring all that stuff into this as well, I mean, you can walk out of this summit feeling like an expert. So I think it's
Yeah.
going to be exciting for people.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again, Sebastian. I appreciate your time.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. And I'm looking forward to seeing what everybody thinks of the summit sessions. It'll be fun to see what comes out of it. You know, what kind of art is produced by people who are just starting out versus, you know, what kind of art is going to be produced by people who are already well along in the path, but then they've never really thought of these one or two other things, and they go and give them a try. And then all of a sudden it might open up a whole new range of possibilities that they never thought of before. And then, you know, who knows what could come of it. So it'll be exciting.
Yeah, sounds great. All right. Appreciate it. Thanks again.
All right. Take care.